Good evening. Welcome to Sandman's Tales. Tonight I have a creepy tale for you called Eliza. I hope you enjoy it. It was an afternoon like any other, the kind of afternoon that hangs heavy in the air just before the storm. I'd been driving for hours, lost in thought, when the sign caught my eye. Antique store, open for a limited time. The words were faded, and the paint on the wooden board had chipped away over the years. The shop stood on the edge of town, wedged between two other buildings that were far more modern, as if the world had passed this place by. The weathered sign beckoned me, and before I knew it, I found myself pulling into the cracked parking lot, unable to shake the feeling that something was waiting for me inside. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and old paper as soon as I opened the door. The shop was dimly lit, and the floorboards creaked beneath my feet, groaning under the weight of time. I stood still for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the gloom. The shelves were stacked high with trinkets, old books, tarnished silverware, yellowed photographs, and dolls. So many dolls. They sat on every shelf, their glassy eyes staring at nothing. Their faces were painted with that eerily serene expression, as though they knew some terrible secret. I wandered deeper into the shop, the dust floating in the thin beams of light that seeped through the heavy curtains. My fingers brushed against the surface of a delicate porcelain teacup, and I noticed the fine cracks that ran through it, as if the years had broken it and pieced it back together again. There was an overwhelming sense of forgotten memories here, things lost to time, abandoned, and now preserved in the small, forgotten shop. And then, I saw it. The doll. It was placed alone on a small shelf in the back corner of the shop, surrounded by cobwebs and dust, as though it had been left there on purpose, waiting for me. The doll wasn't anything special at first glance, but there was something about it that made my blood run cold. It was made of porcelain, its face cracked in places, the paint faded. Its clothes were tattered, the fabric torn at the edges, and its hair, what little remained, was thin and brittle, clinging to the doll's scalp like a long-forgotten memory. But it was the eyes. Those eyes. Black, soulless, hollow. They didn't look like the eyes of a doll. They were too real. They seemed to follow me, even as I stood frozen in the doorway, a shiver running down my spine. I didn't want to move closer, but some invisible force, urged me forward. As I stepped toward the shelf, I noticed the faintest of smiles curling at the corners of the doll's mouth. It wasn't a warm smile. It was something else, something darker, colder. Came a voice from behind me, startling me out of my trance. I turned quickly to see the shopkeeper. He was a thin man with a graying beard, his clothes old and mismatched. He had appeared so quietly that I hadn't noticed his presence. "You found her," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. I nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. My gaze returned to the doll. "Who is she?" The shopkeeper shuffled closer, his feet making almost no sound on the creaky floor. His eyes locked onto the doll with an unsettling intensity. "Her name is Eliza," he said, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "She's special." I blinked, uncertain if he was being serious. "Special?" He nodded slowly, reaching out to touch the doll's cracked face, his hand trembling slightly. "Eliza has been here a very long time. She's not like the others." I felt a cold rush of unease wash over me. "What do you mean?" He looked at me then, his expression distant, as though his mind were elsewhere. "Eliza, she was once loved. By a little girl. But one day, the girl disappeared, and Eliza was left behind, waiting for someone to take her home." I frowned, feeling an uncomfortable knot form in my stomach. "What happened to the little girl?" The shopkeeper's eyes darkened, and he looked away. "No one knows. She vanished without a trace. The only thing that remained was Eliza. She waited, and she still waits." There was a long silence between us, the air growing colder. I turned back to the doll. The longer I looked at her, the more unsettling she became. The smile on her face seemed to grow wider, more sinister, and I had to fight the urge to step back. I tried to laugh, to shake off the discomfort that was settling deep in my chest. It's just a doll, I said, forcing the words out. Just a very creepy doll. But the shopkeeper didn't smile. He didn't seem to find my attempt at humor funny. It's not just a doll, he said quietly, almost a whisper. It's her. Something about the way he said it, his voice barely audible, but filled with so much weight, made me shiver. The room felt colder, and I was aware of a soft rustling sound, like the creaking of floorboards, but no one was moving. Not the shopkeeper, not the dolls. I looked back at Eliza. Her eyes were still fixed on me, but now they seemed different, more alive. A soft, almost imperceptible giggle reached my ears, and I froze. My heart began to race. Did you hear that? I asked, my voice shaking. The shopkeeper's face had paled, and he didn't answer. He simply stood there, watching me. Another giggle, louder this time. It wasn't coming from the shopkeeper. It wasn't coming from anywhere in the room. It was coming from the doll. I took a step back, my legs trembling, but my feet felt like they were stuck in place. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. She's not just a doll, the shopkeeper whispered. Once she chooses, once you make the connection, there's no going back. I glanced at the door, but it was too far to reach. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled forward, trying to pull my hand away, but it felt as though my fingers had frozen to the porcelain. The chill from the doll's face seeped into my hand, up my arm, spreading through my body. The doll's lips twitched, and her smile deepened. No, I gasped, trying to free myself, but it was no use. I couldn't move. Eliza has chosen you, the shopkeeper said, his voice hollow, distant. And now you belong to her. I could feel the pressure of her presence, closing in around me. The shadows in the room began to stretch, to twist, to take on shapes that weren't quite right. There were whispers, soft at first, then growing louder. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel their meaning deep in my bones. The doll's eyes never left me. In the reflection of her black eyes, I saw the girl, no, the spirit that had once owned Eliza. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow like the doll's, her mouth frozen in that same sinister smile. She reached out with thin, bony fingers, and I felt a cold, icy grip on my wrist. The giggling came again, louder this time, almost like a child's laugh, but distorted, hollow, as if it came from some place where no children should be. Suddenly, the room began to spin. The walls seemed to pulse and shrink, closing in on me. The door was just beyond my reach, but it was as if the very air itself had thickened, making it impossible to move, to breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the laughter stopped. Silence. I was no longer in the shop. The air was damp, cold, like I was standing in the graveyard of forgotten things. I looked around, and there she was, Eliza, standing at the edge of the graveyard. Her eyes locked onto mine, and I knew, with a sinking certainty, that I had made a terrible mistake. I had chosen her. I was never leaving. The next morning, the shop was gone. The street where it had stood was empty, no sign of the building, no traces left behind. But when I arrived back home, I found something waiting for me on my doorstep. A small porcelain doll. It was the same one, Eliza, and this time her smile was wider than ever. I do hope that you enjoyed this story. If you are brave enough, then do subscribe for more tales, and be sure to visit again soon. If you dare.